Japanese troops were locked in brutal fighting along the Dror River in New Guinea, where hundreds of soldiers inched forward to take up positions on the bank. Under the pale glow of the midnight sun, towering reeds partly concealed their movements, yet the squelch of exhausted men sliding through mud could not be silenced. Officers strained to catch any sign that the enemy had detected them, while sergeants hissed instructions to hold their voices. The soldiers of Major Moritoshi Kashi's 78th Infantry Regiment felt more than fear knotting their insides as they waited for the order to strike. Relentless hunger clawed at them. For weeks they had been reduced to grazing on grass and insects during their grueling march through swamps and rainforests, and the few rations that remained could not keep pace with the column. Those troops had arrived at this desperate point through sheer force of will and rigid discipline. But whether that fighting spirit would be enough against the powerful American forces arrayed opposite them remained uncertain. That night, one figure crouched beside the river who believed he had an answer. He was the architect of the risky plan and the commander of the Japanese 18th Army, Lieutenant General Afua Aitake. The sweeping Allied leapfrog invasions along the northern New Guinea coast in spring 1944 severed Adaki's command from the rest of Japan's Southern Army, leaving his 55,000 men effectively abandoned by Imperial General Headquarters. The United States launched simultaneous amphibious assaults at Hollandia and Aitape on April 22, 1944, and from his headquarters at Wewak Adaki searched in vain for ways to blunt the threat. He could not prevent his men from dying slowly of starvation and disease. He weighed options: strike the enemy some distance away at Aitape, try to force his way through Allied lines to link up with Japanese forces farther west, or accept routes that offered little hope of relief. None of these possibilities appealed to the 61-year-old commander. To avoid the Allied landings at Aitape and Hollandia, the 18th Army would have to trek roughly 600 miles through uncharted jungle. Yet it was short of food, transport, and medical supplies. Adaki knew his troops were ill-equipped for such a march. Many were already exhausted from previous withdrawals across eastern New Guinea, so he concluded his only remaining course was to mount an offensive. Adaki considered striking at the Allied airfields around Aitape with his best infantry, since 2 months' worth of supplies were on hand. Success there might allow a 120-mile advance westward to Hollandia to seize materiel and resupply. That scheme, born of its planner's resolve, relied far more on the Japanese soldiers' fighting spirit than on sound strategic calculation. Afua Aitake was born in Tokyo on June 17, 1890, the son of an army officer, and the tall, stern youth raised in samurai traditions seemed destined for a military life. After graduating from the Tokyo Cadet Academy, he became a lieutenant in the Imperial Guard Division in 1910, and throughout peacetime service, his stoicism, self-sacrifice, and physical toughness were evident. He saw combat in Manchuria and China in the 1930s, and as a colonel and regimental commander, he earned a reputation for personal courage, often leading from the front and foregoing comforts afforded other officers. He was wounded by mortar fragments that left lasting injuries and a limp. Promoted steadily, by 1940, he wore the insignia of Lieutenant General and in the fall of 1941 was named Chief of Staff of the South China Area Army after successfully leading the 37th Division. After commanding the newly formed 18th Army for a year, he left China to establish his headquarters in New Guinea. When he arrived in January 1943, he confronted the humiliating fact that Japanese forces had been beaten back. Enemy troops had captured the vital port of Buna after fierce fighting, and the remaining garrison retreated westward, abandoning most of its supplies. The war's momentum was shifting against Lieutenant General Adaki, who now faced the impossible duty of defending 400 miles of coastline against an opponent that ruled both sea and sky. Any reinforcements headed toward the 18th Army's sector had to run a deadly gauntlet of Allied naval and aerial attacks. On paper, the Japanese presence in eastern New Guinea seemed formidable, with the 20th, 41st, and 51st Divisions totaling around 60,000 troops. In reality, these formations were dangerously weakened. In March 1943, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, 8 transports carrying much of the 51st Division were sunk, costing 3,000 lives and the bulk of the unit's heavy weapons. Adaki himself narrowly escaped death when bombs struck the destroyer, transporting him and his staff to their new base. About 9,000 Army and Navy men were left to guard the crucial airfields at Lae and Salamaua. When American and Australian infantry landed in June, they threatened to cut off the defenders between two converging attacks. Soldiers still able to march were ordered to cross the rugged Saruwaged Mountains with just 10 days' food supplies, embarking on a desperate trek. Their ordeal was catastrophic. Hunger, exposure, and malaria claimed thousands, and 2,200 of the 8,600 men never emerged from the jungle alive. The Salamaua garrison's fate laid bare the staggering obstacles of warfare in New Guinea. At nearly 500,000 square miles, New Guinea was largely unknown to the outside world before 1943-44. Vast stretches of its land remained unmapped, and for those forced to fight and die there, its dangers seemed endless. Swamps and tangled rainforests choked the coasts, nourished by more than 100 inches of rain each year, but the dense greenery offered almost nothing to eat. Japanese soldiers derisively nicknamed the island the Green Desert, the Owen Stanley Range. A mountain spine running the length of the island, rose only a few dozen miles from the shoreline, feeding rivers and valleys that were nearly impassable without bridges or boats. Small native villages and colonial outposts dotted the northern coast, linked by rough footpaths or sporadic roads that quickly dissolved into mud during the rains. Disease was relentless. Malaria, typhus, and other tropical illnesses struck down anyone without protection, while giant rats carried infection. The climate was just as punishing. Days often topped 100 degrees, humidity was suffocating, and when the rains came, they did not stop, sometimes for half the year. Our weapons rusted away, iron corroded. Wounds refused to heal, recalled Sergeant Masatsu Owada of the 20th Division. Adaki now confronted not only these natural challenges, but also the collapse of Japanese strength in the air and at sea. By late 1943, Allied bombers had virtually annihilated Japan's 4th Air Army, while new aircraft arriving from America and Australia, supported by Allied warships, overwhelmed the remnants of the 9th Fleet. Surviving Japanese patrol boats and barges crept along the coast by night, trying to deliver supplies. In September 1943, Australian veterans of the 7th Division landed near Finschhafen on the Huon Peninsula, and Adaki was forced into another retreat, drawing his worn-out troops westward toward Wewak, Hansa Bay, and Madang. The 3-month march through grueling terrain was mostly carried out at night, but eventually the 18th Army regrouped in those positions. By the autumn of 1943, Japan's Imperial General Headquarters realized its southern strategy had collapsed. On September 30th, Tokyo staff officers revised the main defensive line across New Guinea, placing it hundreds of miles behind Adaki's positions and effectively abandoning his 55,000 troops. Command of the 18th Army was transferred to the 2nd Area Army under General Korochika Anami, based in western New Guinea. Adaki, previously operating under General Hitoshi Imamura from Rabaul, now answered to Anami, though the reality was that neither commander had the means to halt the Allies. Tokyo continued to issue conflicting orders, hold strong points on the northeast coast while simultaneously pulling forces west toward the new defense line. Some dispatches even demanded impossible marches, such as covering 215 miles to Hollandia in absurdly short time frames. General Anami confided in his diary that headquarters was in chaos, though he still relayed the directives to Adaki, who had little choice but to adapt. From his position over 1,300 miles away, Adaki had a far clearer view of the battlefield. By March 1944, signs of an impending Allied strike at Wewak were unmistakable. Rubber rafts from reconnaissance teams found on beaches, enemy aircraft constantly overhead. Realizing that blindly following orders would doom his men, Adaki decided to disobey Tokyo and concentrate his defenses at Wewak and Hansa Bay, notifying his superiors by radio. The Japanese had no inkling that every radio transmission sent to or from the 18th Army was being intercepted and decoded by Allied cryptanalysts using Ultra. Their private signals were an open book to the enemy. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, recognized that his deception had succeeded. Dummy inflatable boats abandoned on likely landing sites had lured Japanese attention, and MacArthur also possessed rough maps of unit locations and strength across New Guinea, intelligence he exploited without delay. On April 22, 1944, American troops executed daring amphibious assaults, storming ashore close to the fortified airfields at Hollandia and Aitape in western New Guinea. By landing between the bulk of the Japanese 18th Army and the remainder of General Anami's 2nd Area Army, the Allies took a calculated gamble. MacArthur banked on his radio interception teams to warn U.S. forces in time to counter any Japanese counterstroke. Japan's commanders, too, longed to strike back. Adaki and his superior Anami believed they could knock out the Allied footholds at Aitape and Hollandia. On April 25th, Anami moved his headquarters from Davao to Manado. Yet Tokyo's war planners saw the situation differently, and on May 2nd, ordered another strategic withdrawal, this time drawing forces toward New Guinea's Vogokok Peninsula. Anami replied by instructing the 18th Army to swing west and plug into the new defensive ring. But the Americans severed radio links between Adaki's front and the 2nd Area Army on May 27th. By June 20th, the Imperial General Headquarters placed the 18th Army under the Southern Army in Singapore, effectively admitting Tokyo could not materially aid the formation. With supply lines cut and reinforcements impossible, Adaki's men were left to hold ground as best they could. Adaki had learned in a lifetime of service that a commander must sometimes improvise rather than simply obey. Japan's military culture prized initiative and the willingness to sacrifice. Like his soldiers, Adaki had pledged to give his life rather than suffer dishonor. In May, he told his officers that honor outweighed life. If both could not be preserved, life should be abandoned in favor of honor. With that austere conviction, he outlined Operation A plan to retake Aitape. On May 5th, he ordered it into motion, and within days, long-range reconnaissance squads set out on foot to chart American defenses and bring back vital intelligence. Troops from the 20th and 41st divisions converged on Wewak after moving out from Madang and Hansa Bay, assembling roughly 5,000 riflemen between them, the most potent units available to Adaki, yet also the ones stationed farthest from the objective. Wewak lay some 200 trail miles from Madang. The distance alone hinted at the ordeal ahead. Except for one regiment, the 51st Division remained behind to act as rear guard to slow the Australians' push from the coast. Nearly 3,000 convalescent soldiers still languished in hospitals, and an astonishing number of able-bodied men were pressed into porter service. In some areas, as many as 6 carriers were assigned to support a single front-line fighter, hauling food, ammunition, and even sections of mountain artillery. Altogether, about 35,000 Japanese troops set out for Aitape during May and June 1944. Before the column could gather momentum, disaster struck. On May 10th, a landing barge ferrying the commander of the 20th Division detonated an Allied sea mine off Wewak, killing the general and his staff and throwing the campaign into disarray. A subsequent air raid wiped out 6 senior officers of the 41st Division, creating a leadership vacuum that would be felt in the field for weeks. To steady the battered force, Adaki personally led the main marching body, while his chief of staff remained behind at Wewak to shoulder the impossible burden of sustaining logistics. The men charged with carrying supplies were heroic but overwhelmed. Testimonies from survivors of the 3rd Battalion, 80th Infantry recalled daily rations of under 12 ounces of rice, biscuits every 2 or 3 days at best, and a paltry allotment of 3 cigarettes every 10 days. Many resorted to chewing sago palm leaves to stave off starvation, but as the column pushed westward, malnutrition tightened its grip. Adaki's original marching schedule, about 8 miles a day, reasonable for New Guinea's rough terrain, was soon halved. Stragglers fell behind in droves and supply lines withered. Essentials such as salt, medicines, and other basic comforts simply ceased to exist. Then the skies opened and the monsoons set in. Weeks of torrential rain turned trails into rivers of mud, wrecked clothing and saturated packs, and hastened the decay of already scant provisions. A veteran sergeant later described the rain mixing with sweat, the way men would stagger, collapse, and then heave themselves to their feet to trudge on, transformed into walking clumps of mud. The sick and exhausted were left along the track. Many corpses lay bloated and blackened in the heat, their bones already near the surface. For the living, the ghastly procession of decomposing bodies became a grim, macabre guidepost toward an uncertain goal. Despite the horrors, two powerful forces pushed the troops forward, the hope of seizing American rations at Aitape and the stubborn refusal to surrender their pride. Many soldiers were driven by the sight of their commanding general sharing the same deprivations. Adaki concealed a debilitating hernia beneath a mask of stoic calm, and few around him knew the extent of his pain. His willingness to endure the same privations bolstered the men's morale and sustained them when otherwise they might have given up. Throughout the march, the Army's morale ebbed and flowed with every small relief or fresh setback. Rain-sodden uniforms bred sores and infections. Primitive latrines and the omnipresent mosquitoes spread malaria and dysentery. Limbs swelled and fevers flared. Discipline sometimes held through sheer force of will, yet desertion and collapse increased as each mile took a heavier toll. Officers tried to keep men moving with harsh commands and the promise of future glory, but the truth was grim. Age, illness, and exhaustion broke countless bodies. Still, when the long, mud-slick route finally delivered them within sight of their objective, the battered columns rallied around the single, galvanizing thought of food and the possibility of striking back at the enemy that had hunted them from the air and sea. They pressed on by night because enemy aircraft made daytime movement deadly. Under cover of darkness, the columns crept forward, trying to snatch sleep in the swampy dawn, scrounging what handfuls of food they could find and clutching fantasies of the feasts they hoped to eat once the enemy was crushed. Each morning, Adaki's radio transmissions, intercepted and read by Allied codebreakers, betrayed the marching column's whereabouts, so MacArthur quickly learned where the Japanese were and what they intended. The Americans defending Aitape steeled themselves for the expected blow, while Australian signal units tracked the arduous Japanese march across New Guinea. Facing Adaki were the men of Task Force Persecution. Major General William H. Gill, commanding elements of the 32nd Infantry Division, held the Taji airfield some 8 miles east of Aitape within a defensive arc, but he also pushed a covering force out to the Dror River, about 15 miles to the east, to give early warning of any Japanese approach. Led by Brigadier General Clarence A. Martin, that screen numbered roughly 3,500 riflemen and was backed by artillery, armor, PT boats, and close air support from Bristol Beauforts of No. 71 Wing. RAF, on 22 May, units from Adaki's 20th Division nearly trapped an American reconnaissance patrol near the coastal village of Nayap. The first clash between the forces, and a larger fight followed at Yakal, 3 miles west of Nap in early June, when men from the 78th and 80th Infantry Regiments ambushed an entire U.S. battalion on 5th of June. Japanese troops closed in only to see Allied landing craft arrive and pull the last company off the beach. By late June, captured Japanese operational orders convinced Generals Gill and Martin that Adaki's offensive was indeed imminent, even if the exact timing and axis remained uncertain. The 18th Army's effective counter-reconnaissance screen kept Allied ground patrols at bay, while misleading interpretations of intercepted signals bred a dangerous complacency among American commanders. MacArthur's intelligence officers expected an attack around 15 June. When that date passed with no large strike, many U.S. officers assumed the Japanese were already falling back toward Wewak. By 1st July, contact with Adaki's forces along the Drumor line had been lost, and a planned assault for 27 June never materialized. Radio silence only added to the frustration of the ultra teams. Yet in the unmapped jungle east of the Dror River, some 20,000 Japanese combat troops were quietly assembling for battle. Delays in supplies, bottlenecks in movement, and mounting exhaustion forced Adaki to postpone more than once. But by the second week of July, he judged his force ready. Often standing within yards of the American earthworks, he handed down his final orders in person. Radio was no longer necessary. Long-range reconnaissance units had done their work. They reported accurately the number of GIs around the Taji airfields and pinpointed enemy supply dumps, aid stations, and command posts. The Japanese noted that 3 American battalions were stretched thin over a 6-mile front and therefore vulnerable. Adaki urged his commanders to strike before the Yanks could reinforce their river line. His scheme called for a straight frontal assault on the night of 10-11 July. 3 infantry regiments would wade or swim the Dror at midnight, smash through the American positions, reform, and press the advance against Task Force Persecution's main defense around the Taji strips after a brief 10-minute artillery preparation. A coastal supporting attack would neutralize American guns sighted near the river mouth. That seaborne effort would draw on elements of the 41st Division under Lieutenant General Goro Mano and the 20th Division under Major General Masaru Nikai. The principal push was to be led by the 237th Infantry Regiment of Mano's Corps, then arriving on the Drumor under Colonel Masahiko Nara. Colonels Tokotaro Ida and Natsuhiro Matsumoto commanded the 20th Division's 80th and 78th Regiments on Nara's left, while Major Yaro Hoshino's 41st Mountain Artillery directed the coastal force. Army Reserve troops were attached from the 66th Infantry of the 51st Division. The Dror itself, borne high in the Teseli Mountains, swung north toward the sea by a cluster of native huts at Afua about 6 miles away. At that bend, the water was only waist-deep and the current slowed, the usual jungle undergrowth giving way to towering reeds and a river roughly 100 yards across with a string of small islands to guide attackers, the largest marked on Japanese charts as Konak Kashima. Despite having solid intelligence, Adaki still lacked critical local details. American infantry had already named probable artillery targets and strung barbed wire before the Japanese arrived, and a full 3,000-man reserve was positioned close by. In addition, 5 battalions, 2 formerly mounted cavalry units now fighting dismounted, plus 3 infantry battalions, were dug in along the Drumor front. The Japanese did not know that Major General Gill had been replaced as the covering force commander by U.S. Army Major General Charles P. Hall. Pressed by MacArthur, Hall resolved to crush the 18th Army rather than allow it to mass against his lines, and on 10 July 1944 he dispatched 2 battalion-sized patrols from the persecution covering force, one sweeping the Pacific coast, the other pushing south toward Afua, to find and destroy this phantom enemy so troops could be freed for the Philippines campaign. Misfortune intervened. Both patrols blundered through the impenetrable rainforest and entirely missed the 18th Army, and Hall then pulled those battalions off the Drumor line instead of from reserve, drastically weakening his covering force just when strength was most needed. Adaki's own preparations also unraveled. Colonel Nara's 237th, the Army's toughest regiment, arrived late and failed to carry out vital pre-assault reconnaissance. The 78th and 80th regiments were jumbled together inside the 20th Division's zone, and there was no time to sort units into their proper places. Then, at 23:50 on 10th of July, a sudden curtain of artillery fire slammed into the forward U.S. positions, driving stunned troopers of the 2nd Battalion, 128th Infantry, deep into their foxholes while machine guns and mortars pinned them down. At that moment, thousands of Japanese soldiers rose from their cover and surged forward. They pushed through the night because daylight meant death beneath Allied aircraft. When parachute flares blossomed overhead, the assault began 5 minutes early as Major Moritoshi Kawaigashi led about 400 men of the 1st Battalion, 78th Infantry toward the river, racing into the dark and reaching midstream just before enemy guns opened up. American artillery and well-sighted automatic weapons cut the advance to pieces, leaving Kawaigashi's men shattered and strewn along the Dror's bank, many dead, many grievously wounded. Elsewhere, a separate group forced its way through the reeds to Kawaigashi's right, but the main effort belonged to Major Yashida's 1st Battalion of the 237th Infantry. In the chaos, one company mistakenly landed on the island marked Kakashima and was mown down by small arms fire, while the remainder were swallowed by a devastating cascade of mortar, grenade, and cannon explosions. When enemy howitzers shifted targets, a strange stillness settled over the ground, but then the next wave of Japanese surged up, stepping over comrades' bodies in a frantic bid to keep the momentum. The Americans watched in stunned alarm as screams, shouted orders, and the staccato of gunfire fused into a terrible, unending roar. Barbed wire that had defended U.S. foxholes vanished into dust and smoke. And although many Japanese died trying to breach the obstacles, sheer weight of men and dwindling Allied ammunition forced U.S. machine guns into silence and kept mortars and guns from firing for fear of hitting their own. Company E of the 128th Infantry was overrun to the north, and by dawn on July 11th, it was plain that the attackers had punched a 2,000-yard hole in the line, compelling the covering force, including the 2 battalions earlier sent out on patrol, to withdraw 3 miles to the west and abandon vast stockpiles of supplies, rations and equipment to the jubilant but bloodied victors. Adaki had won his first objective, though at a cost of more than 800 men. Those who had made the crossing were scattered, poorly organized, and short of officers. Some leaders, like Colonel Nera of the 237th, vanished for days, and likely crossing points and concentration areas were relentlessly pounded by Allied howitzers and fighter bombers. At first light on July 13th, Major Hino's Coastal Assault Force reported ambushing a U.S. counterstroke, knocking out 2 tanks and inflicting casualties, and reconnaissance initially suggested American units were in retreat as fresh Japanese reinforcements poured west across the Dror. But American commanders Hall and Gill were already assembling a powerful counterpunch: 5 full infantry battalions, 2 cavalry squadrons, and a ring of naval gunfire. Air strikes and artillery support were readied to seal the breach and annihilate the 18th Army. Major Hosino's men were among the first to feel that force as riflemen of the 1st Battalion. 128th Infantry advanced under a rolling artillery barrage late on July 13th, while M10 tank destroyers on the beach and rocket-armed landing craft added mechanized fire. By dusk, Allied fire had cut Hino's coastal force to pieces. Americans controlled the mouth of the Dror, and the 128th pushed south to link with the 112th Cavalry, which from its base at Afua, 6 miles upstream, was pressing north. Thousands of Japanese still stood between those converging Allied columns, exhausted, short of ammunition, yet buoyed by stolen American rations now filling their bellies, and on July 14th, Adaki shuffled his battered command, combining the 78th and 80th regiments under Major Sahiro Miyake of the 20th Division, and sending this so-called Macaca force to seize a jungle ridge directly in front of the advancing U.S. 112th Cavalry. The Afua Crossroads became the contested heart of the campaign. 10 native huts there changed hands repeatedly through late July and early August as Macaca force continued to suffer from disease, ambushes, and sheer fatigue. As the struggle dragged on both sides complained of the other's localized strong points while neither enjoyed decisive terrain, reconnaissance remained poor, maps were unreliable, and operations in the broken country around Afua often resembled aimless shadow boxing punctuated by sudden, deadly contact. By the end of July, both Adaki and his American adversaries braced for a climactic do-or-die fight over the Aitape area. In a later letter, Lieutenant General Yoshihara wrote that Adaki's men had run out of food and ammunition and were no longer able to sustain themselves or continue protracted fighting. Time was running out for the Japanese as Major General Hall now faced him with a cavalry regiment and 3 full U.S. infantry divisions, outnumbering Adaki nearly 4-1. From the Dror's mouth, Hall threw 4 rifle battalions on July 31st into a pincer intended to encircle and cut off the 18th Army, while the 41st Division guarded the approaches. On August 1st, the decisive clash for Afua began. Japanese artillery smashed enemy positions with every remaining shell as riflemen of the 66th Infantry prepared a last-ditch assault on the Japanese flank. Adaki committed his final reserve, the 66th, which led a desperate charge across the Dror that morning alongside survivors of the 20th and 41st Divisions. After 3 weeks of unrelenting shelling and rain, the terrain was a sodden graveyard of shattered trees, cratered ground, and knee-deep mud. The attackers, battered by harsh ground and punishing fire, suffered massive losses and gained little, and by dusk, the assault collapsed. Reluctantly, Adaki ordered the starving remnants of his once vigorous 18th Army to begin the grueling withdrawal back toward Wewak. In the days that followed, small raids continued largely to mask the main force's retreat, and when patrols later probed the Dror, they found a scene of appalling carnage. A 112th Cavalry trooper later remembered thinking the stream was clogged with logs until he realized the logs were hundreds of dead Japanese bodies. Estimates placed nearly 10,000 of Adaki's men killed or missing during the campaign, though the exact toll may never be known. Losses were heaviest in the infantry formations. For instance, the 7th Regiment entered with roughly 300 effectives and left with about 350. A casualty rate of roughly 73%, with similar devastation reported across other units. Task Force persecution counted 2,550 wounded, 10 missing and 440 killed. U.S. patrols pursued the shattered Japanese back toward Wewak for weeks, trading close quarters skirmishes with rear guard detachments, and on August 25th, Major General Hall declared the Aitape operation concluded. The 18th Army's ordeal, however, did not end there. When Wewak fell to the Australian 6th Division in May 1945, the remnants were driven into the mountains, where they remained cut off until the war's end. Of the estimated 150,000 Japanese who had served with Adaki in New Guinea, only about 13,000 survived to be taken prisoner alongside their commander. Adaki himself was later tried and convicted for war crimes related to atrocities against Allied prisoners and civilians in New Guinea, and sentenced to life imprisonment. But on September 10, 1947, he ended his own life with a ceremonial knife. Like so many under his command, he never returned home, his remains resting in some forgotten Pacific grave. The account was contributed by Patrick J. Chasen, a retired U.S. Army officer